Yes, so my name is Eri Saikawa. I'm an associate professor at Emory University. I would like to welcome you all to Emory Climate Talks, partnering with Resilience and Sustainability Collaboratory, Department of Environmental Sciences, Emory Climate Organization, and Goizueta Energy and Environmental Group. This conference was made possible by a donor that's sponsoring the Emory Climate Talks. We're extremely excited that Ms. Naomi Klein, the speaker chosen by the students for this conference, agreed to speak in a very short notice. Without taking up the time, I would like to give the floor to the student representative, Georgia Spies, who will be introducing the speaker.
Hello, everyone. We are extremely excited to welcome Naomi Klein to our third annual Universities for a Greener Georgia conference. Naomi Klein is an award-winning journalist, columnist, and the #1 international best-selling author of seminal books, The Shock Doctrine and No Logo. In her book, This Changes Everything, and in Powerful New Talks, she exposes the myths of the climate debate. One quote from the New York Times calls the book the most momentous and contentious environmental book since Silent Spring. Her newest book, On Fire, takes on the global climate justice movement and makes an urgent case for a Green New Deal. For the duration of the talk, we are asking everyone to please turn off your camera and mute yourself. Afterward, there will be a Q&A session where you can type your questions into the chat and the moderators will read the questions out loud. As a final note, this is being recorded and will later be posted to the Climate Talks website. Thank you so much for coming, Ms. Klein. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Hi, everyone. This is my first lecture-ish thing since lockdown. I've been teaching my own students at Rutgers over Zoom. And of course, I've been doing lots of public teach-ins and interviews, but I haven't visited another university in this way. So I'm delighted to be with you. I'm really pleased that you went ahead with your really important programming, because I know that a lot of things are just simply being canceled. But this is an incredibly important conversation, and it is a reminder that though we are in the midst of a global health crisis, and it is by no means over, and I'm speaking to you from New Jersey, with yesterday in one day listed 308 deaths. So that makes New Jersey the state with the highest death rate at the moment. It's a really, really frightening time. I have colleagues and friends who have been very, very sick. And we don't have solutions. We are still very much in it, but we are also still very much in the ongoing climate crisis. The Green New Deal, which is the framework that I have been working for with many other activists, academics, and visionary politicians over the past decade, is really about multitasking. At its core, a Green New Deal is not a narrow climate policy that only looks at parts per million of climate in the atmosphere. It is a plan for the next economy. And it is about recognizing that we live in a time of overlapping and intersecting crises, and they are all urgent and they are all existential. And if you are on the front lines of the crisis of racial injustice, then that is an existential crisis for you and your family. And so the Green New Deal framework is really about rejecting a hierarchy of crisis that says, look, let's save the planet and then we'll worry about everything else. Then we'll worry about fighting poverty and racism and gender exclusion. It is about recognizing the way all of these crises intersect, and we're certainly seeing that in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, that we can't pry apart the impacts of this disaster from economic inequality, from racial inequality, whose communities have the pre-existing conditions that make this disease more lethal. We can't pry it apart. And so we need to find routes out of crisis that solve multiple problems at once. So a Green New Deal framework is about listening to what scientists have told us with increasing clarity over the years that we need, to quote the 2018 IPCC report that said that in order to keep temperatures warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need, and I quote, fundamental transformation of virtually every aspect of society. Now, in order to achieve fundamental transformation of every aspect of society, right, we're talking about agriculture, we're talking about energy, we're talking about transportation, how we live in cities. If we are going to change everything, then why wouldn't we fight poverty, inequality, and all of these overlapping injustices and exclusions at the same time? After all, we're changing everything. And so the Green New Deal framework is beginning to lay out what that would look like. And it is a sweeping process, but it has become more specific with policies like those introduced by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Bernie Sanders, that begin, for instance, with public housing and initiatives that would get public housing to 100% renewable energy, much higher levels of energy efficiency, more green space, public health and childcare facilities inside public housing. And if you haven't read that legislation, it's definitely worth taking a look at. You know, when we first started talking about a Green New Deal, you know, I guess a year and a half ago now, a lot of the pushback was, well, why is there so much in it that isn't about climate? Why does it say we need universal public health care and childcare? Why are we trying to do so much so fast? And when I was touring with On Fire in the fall, that was often what I heard, not questioning the necessity of these transformations, but just saying that it really isn't realistic to expect things to change so much and so fast. And it is true that the historical precedents that we draw upon when we say it is possible to change things as quickly as scientists are telling us we need to do, right? That IPCC report that came out in 2018, the 1.5 Celsius report, said that we needed to get to 100% renewable energy by mid-century, and that we needed to cut emissions in half in just 12 years, and that was 2 years ago. And the pushback that I got talking about the Green New Deal in the press and you know in some audience context was, look, the original New Deal, which did change the U.S. economy very, very quickly over a period of a decade, or the Second World War mobilizations, which transformed U.S. industry in just an even shorter period of time. Changed how Americans produced food, how Americans related to transit and oil consumption, led to a proliferation of victory gardens to the point where in 1946, Americans were getting around 40% of their produce from backyard gardens, from victory gardens. The response that I would hear is, whether it was the Second World War or the Great Depression, those were moments of profound crisis. And so there was an appetite for big change, for deep change, for fast change. And this is just a few months ago, people really didn't feel that we were in a moment like that, that yes, climate is a theoretical crisis, but unless you happen to be in the path of a Category 5 hurricane, or a wildfire, it didn't feel like an existential crisis to you. And so the traditional economic indicators just a couple of months ago were pretty solid, as Donald Trump likes to remind us all the time. And so the idea was that it was not going to be possible to get a Green New Deal. And this is what we also heard during the presidential primaries for the Democratic Party, that it was just kind of too much, too fast, especially given the relative health of the US economy. Now, of course, behind those traditional economic indicators, like a low unemployment rate, like a booming stock market, was the reality that huge numbers of people were having to work multiple jobs to survive, was a reality of increased economic precarity, of massive racial wealth gap, of unequal pay for women, and so on. But what there wasn't was that sense of widespread urgency and crisis. And so we find ourselves in a very different moment having this conversation, because obviously we are in a moment of crisis now, and it is a public health emergency, but it is also a public health emergency that manifests as a global economic crisis, not just a recession, but going into depression levels of unemployment. And so policies that looked unrealistic just a few months ago, now actually in some ways, some of them look too small, too modest actually, to create the numbers of jobs that we need to have the kind of recovery that families need in a moment like the one we're living through. So, you know, I often quote Milton Friedman, the late famed free market economist, a very radical free market economist, who said, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. And he went on to say, our job is to keep the ideas ready until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. When I wrote the Shock Doctrine and quoted Milton Friedman saying that, the truth is that it was mostly the free market think tanks that had ideas that were lying around, ready to go in the midst of crisis. But we are in a different moment precisely because of all of that work that has gone into creating the framework that now goes under the name of Green New Deal. All of the work of frontline climate justice organizations, all of the relationships between climate activists and labor activists, although often, you know, it has been very difficult and troubled work. All of this is, and all of the collaborations with climate scientists and social scientists, and recognizing that this is something that is really going to take everybody, all of our expertise, including artists. And so we were starting to see that kind of coalition. And so now this is a moment where, you know, we will either find climate shocked out of the way as everything becomes just about reviving the economy at any cost. And there's certainly a push by the Trump administration and other governments around the world to do just that. We're seeing, in the name of crisis, the suspension of EPA regulations. In Australia, the government is talking about a gas-led recovery, but first we need to cut the so-called green tape. China is trying to revive its economy by suspending enforcement of pollution controls. Obviously, for a disease that we are seeing is partly related to people's exposure to air pollution, that it is more fatal in areas that have high levels of air pollution because people's lungs are impacted, and this is a virus that attacks the lungs. It makes absolutely no sense for us to suspend our inadequate laws that protect air quality. In fact, we should be looking to toughen them up. And I think it's really important for folks to understand that just because we may be focused on the emergency at hand, there are forces, very opportunistic forces, that are moving very quickly to take advantage of this crisis to push policies that will actually make us more crisis prone in the future. And that's just one example. I could go on. I'm also looking at what I'm calling the Screen New Deal, which is the way tech companies are taking advantage of this crisis to push things like ongoing and forever remote learning. And I don't know about you, but I do prefer to be in rooms filled with human beings than staring at screens of names and microphones with lines through them. You know, that said, I am grateful for technologies that make it possible to only travel when it really is essential, when it really is necessary. So we need to come up with a plan for an economy that is built on what is essential. What is essential is caring for each other, and what is essential is caring for the earth. And we need those values embedded in the economy that we decide to stimulate, that we decide to revive, because we aren't going back to where we were before this crisis. Arundhati Roy talks about the pandemic as a portal. It is a portal taking us somewhere else. That somewhere else could be more unequal, it could be more brutal, it could be more polluted. it could be more racist, it could be more xenophobic, or we could go somewhere that builds on the realizations that so many of us have had in isolation, which is that we miss each other, which is that we appreciate the people who care for us, whether they're growing our food or caring for the elderly, labor that has been made visible by this pandemic, and which capitalism does a very good job of invisibilizing during normal times. And also the appreciation and the solace that many of us have taken from nature and the return of birdsong and wildlife in this moment of so much loss and grief. And so I think that that is the task. It is to build on those realizations of how important our relationships are, how important we are to each other, the fact that we don't actually like living alone staring at screens. If this is a grand experiment, the results are in, and we want to live differently. And also the lesson that no crisis can be isolated from the pre-existing crises that deepen them and make them worse, and lead them to play out so unequally. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. We're so excited to have you, and we're so fortunate to have this recording as well. I just typed that we'll be welcoming questions in the chat message. If you have any that you would like to ask, please feel free to use that. I would like to start off with a question that I had. You're a great activist and a reporter that gives voice to everyone at large. What do you consider to be the major difficulties you face in climate communication involving often forgotten voices? What can we do at higher education to make sure that we equip the youth with these skills?
Well, I think that's it's a really important question. And, you know, I think they're really related, because this perception that climate change is abstract or far off, right, I think is intimately connected to the fact that many of the most prominent spokespeople for the issue have tended to be people who are at some remove from the direct impacts. They tend not to be people who have been forced to leave their home countries because of climate change, or who have already faced internal displacement, or whose bodies have borne the toxic brunt of our addiction to fossil fuels, because they have their dirty industries in their backyards in urban settings, or because their indigenous lands have been sites of extreme extraction and treaty violation in the process. So, you know, I think there are many reasons for us to not just make an effort, but really hold ourselves accountable about having the people most impacted by any crisis speak for themselves, right? And in academia, we have all kinds of opportunities to create platforms for that discussion to happen. But I think one of the reasons why it is so urgent is that it is simply more impactful, right? The reason why we are as far back as we are in rolling out climate policies at scale, I think a huge amount has to do with this persistent perception that there's time for delay. And that has everything to do with the people speaking about climate change being almost exclusively people who aren't speaking from that place of direct impact. I think we've started to see a change in that, a generational shift in that, just because so many young people are, you know, as part of the youth climate strike movement, are talking about their direct experiences, surviving hurricanes, wildfires, how it has shaped their lives, their dreams already. And we need to build on that. Just one moment, I'm just gonna get a cough drop. Hold on. I can hear your question, just ask.
Okay.
So,
Georgia, did you want to?
Yes. So a question in the chat asks, what are your views on meat consumption with its connection to the coronavirus, impact on the environment and our health, as well as the labor rights issues?
So that's a great question. And, you know, I don't think there's ever been a better time to talk about it, frankly, because, you know, the Trump administration has ordered meat processing facilities to stay open because he has labeled meat as essential. And it clearly is not. Food is essential, but meat is not essential. Chicken is not essential. Hamburgers are not essential. So in labeling unsafe workplaces where workers are dying and getting sick in absolutely huge numbers and saying, you know, you do not have to guarantee a safe workplace because these what you're are delivering is so essential. I mean, people are literally being told that their lives are worth less than hamburgers. You know, we're starting to hear this from a lot of so-called essential workers who are saying we're simultaneously essential and sacrificial, which is a phrase that was used by a subway driver in New York City, simultaneously essential and sacrificial. And so, you know, families of workers in these facilities have called on consumers to not eat meat for a month and see whether that increases the bargaining power of their parents and other relatives inside these plants, because they are being treated as disposable. And as unemployment skyrockets in this country, unfortunately, one of the effects of this is that it decreases the power of workers because employers get the message that no matter how badly you treat your workforce, there's going to be other desperate workers who are willing to fill those slots. And you know, with the unemployment levels where they are right now, that's unfortunately true. And so that's why I think the role of consumers in this is so important. You know, it's good for your health. It's good for worker solidarity. It's a good time not to eat meat. What can I tell you?
Okay, it's great to see a lot of questions coming in. So another question, it goes, how do you see the data science tools to minimize the climate change issues?
I mean, it certainly is. I mean, we would be nowhere without climate models. It's not one of my particular areas of expertise, though, so I'm probably not the best person to say more than that. One thing I would add on the meat question, though, that I think is important is that you know, we're still having debates about the origins of this pandemic, but we do know that we are seeing more viruses leap from animals to humans because of the pressures being put on wilderness by industrial agriculture, particularly cattle farming and other forms of industrial farming.
So the next question from the chat asks, how do you educate and find coherence broadly in a time of such polarization?
That's a big one. Can you say it again?
Yes, I can. How do you educate and find coherence broadly in a time of such polarization?
You know, I mean, I don't think that's an answer that any one person can answer or provide one answer for. I think there are many, many answers. And one of the things I have found over the years is, as communicators, right, we all have particular spheres where we're going to have more influence than others. So the idea that one person needs to be able to communicate effectively to everyone, I think is really a fallacy. I think that this is a this is very much a team project where we all need to be out there educating, across polarizations in the areas where we personally have the most credibility, where we have community ties, where we have relationships, and there are going to be people who, are, never going to be interested in what, a socialist Jewish feminist, in New Jersey has to say about climate change. And that's okay. Like, there are plenty, and maybe Pope Francis's encyclical on the ecological crisis will be a more useful tool than one of my books. I think that the climate movement has been getting broader and broader and more diverse and developing a better ecosystem of communicators, right? I mean, there are people for whom climate scientists are going to be, the only people they want to hear from. They're, hyper rational thinkers, and that's where they want to get their information. And maybe they're scientists themselves, but there are other people who are going to trust, their kid's teacher more. We know that that nurses and teachers are some of the most trusted professions. I've done work with the LEAP with National Nurses United on climate communications, where they're very aware that as nurses, as healthcare workers, they are particularly trusted spokespeople. So I think that in identifying who the trusted figures are in your communities are how you're going to have your best chance of overcoming those polarizations. The idea that there's one message, one narrative that is going to work everywhere, I think is not right.
Okay, great. Shifting the gears a little bit to energy, what could clean energy advocates be doing better to promote renewable energy jobs and other sustainable policies during this time? Well,
I think we are, as I talked about, we are in a moment where where a massive public health crisis that we're still in the middle of has created an economic crisis, the likes of which we haven't seen in some ways since the Great Depression in terms of the unemployment levels that are projected. A Green New Deal was always conceived of first and foremost as a jobs program, just as the original New Deal was, right? And so one of the things that I think is important for those of you who are interested in this to do is read a little history about the original New Deal and how many millions of jobs were created directly by the federal government under programs like the WTA, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which is very relevant to a Green New Deal because the Civilian Conservation Corps was a program that FDR introduced because during the Great Depression, there was also an ecological crisis. This was the time of the Dust Bowl, of massive soil erosion and deforestation. And one of the first things FDR did was roll out a program that would eventually hire more than 2 million young people to go out and plant more than 2 billion trees, which is half the number of trees ever planted in the United States. There's really good research about how many more jobs are created when we invest in conservation, in energy efficiency, in public transit, in green energy than when we put those same dollars in oil and gas infrastructure. And the fact is that the collapse in the price of oil and gas has made many of those sectors uneconomic right now, right? We have been in North America in the middle of an oil and gas boom, but that has been intimately tied to high oil and gas prices because it's actually pretty expensive to get out oil, from shale and from the Alberta tar sands. This is expensive oil and this is expensive production or deep water because the easy to access oil is pretty diminished. So as the price of oil is depressed, it's actually an even better time to be presenting green jobs, not just as more plentiful, if we invest in them, you create more of them per dollar, many more of them, 7 to 8 times more of them than if you invest in fossil fuel infrastructure, but also much more stable because you have so many communities that have been on this commodity roller coaster, right? Because their fates are tied to the price of this raw commodity, which is simply not true for renewables. You know, and we've heard this sort of fossil fuel messaging for so many years about how unreliable renewables are. And unfortunately, Michael Moore's documentary is doing, you know, the industry's work for it by spreading some very dated information about the unreliability of renewables. You know, that the information in that film is very out of date, and we know with battery power, they actually are reliable. And they're a hell of a lot more reliable than pinning your hopes on a commodity that can collapse on the whims of, you know, Saudi monarchs and Russian oil oligarchs.
The next question in the chat asks, could you speak more about how struggles for labor justice are related to climate justice? How can we reconcile the importance of protecting the earth with the economic needs of poor countries / regions dependent on resource extraction?
Yeah, so I mean, the labor piece is a really key one. And I mentioned earlier that a lot of work has been done by groups like Labor Network for Sustainability, building relationships, and coming up with a framework of what a justice-based transition would look like, right? And if you read the text of the original Green New Deal resolution from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's office, but also the way it was unpacked in the platforms of different primary candidates like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Jay Inslee. It's all about including workers in the design of the transition, right? I mean, one of the things we're up against is that even the word transition among workers is seen as, like it was said to me by a trade union organizer, that's what they say to us before they say you're fired. It's like management consultant speak that workers don't believe will actually take care of them, and they base that on experience, that they have been laid off in many cases, that their employer talked about helping them through the transition and it didn't happen, right? And that's why measures in the Green New Deal frameworks that I'm mentioning talk about a salary guarantee, a benefit guarantee, because I think one of the big mistakes that we've made in the climate movement is we've talked about jobs as interchangeable. Like, so like, sure, yeah, you're gonna lose your job being paid more than $100,000 laying pipeline, but we're gonna give you a job, you know, putting up wind turbines, and isn't that great? And we haven't engaged with the reality that a lot of those fossil fuel jobs are unionized jobs, they pay middle-class salaries, and a lot of the green jobs are ununionized and they pay $13 to $15 an hour, and they don't support families. And so you know, really uniting the fight for labor rights, for the right to join trade unions, to organize collectively, and being very clear that we're talking about protecting the gains made by organized labor in these sectors as workers retrain for new fields is really embedded in this. And I think a lot of this becomes more thinkable, right, in a moment where, you know, in the context of the economic crisis we're in right now, countries are adopting universal basic income. You know, if we're willing to pay workers 80% of their salaries to stay home, which is happening in some countries, and we've seen increases in unemployment insurance in this country, it becomes more thinkable to talk about paying workers to retrain, right? So this is part of, I think, how we need to build on the moment that we're in right now and what becomes possible during a crisis, as I was saying earlier. But you mentioned international justice and solidarity, and countries that rely on resource extraction and what the offer is to them, right? In This Changes Everything, I talk, you know, I began that book with a quote from a Bolivian climate negotiator named Angelica Navarro, who called for a Marshall Plan for planet Earth, based on the concept of ecological debt, based on the fact that this is a crisis that has overwhelmingly been created in the rich world and is being overwhelmingly felt in poor countries like Bolivia that did very little to lead to the warming of our planet. And so are therefore owed a debt, and that debt can be paid in various ways. And one of them is transfers of technology, which is what Angelica Navarro was talking about, the resources that they need to protect their forests, leave oil in the ground, and still have money for health, education, and leapfrogging over dirty energy and going directly to clean energy. And that's going to require a transfer of wealth. You know, I was involved in the Sanders campaign pretty actively, and the reason why I ended up backing Bernie over the other possible candidates, who a couple of whom had some really good Green New Deal platforms. I mentioned Warren, I mentioned Inslee. What set Bernie's plan apart from the others is that it was the only one that was genuinely internationalist and recognized the debt owed by the United States to the global South, and committed to mobilizing $200 billion for this kind of payment of our ecological debts, even if it didn't use that language, and also recognize that as a wealthy country that has been emitting carbon on an industrial scale for a couple of hundred years, we need to move faster. We need to do more in terms of hitting those IPCC targets. The other thing I would just say is that, this is not, we aren't going to do what we need to do just by switching to renewable energy. There is going to have to be a contraction of how much we consume, how much energy we consume, particularly we who are part of that 20% of the world that is responsible for 70% of the emissions.
So one of the participants says that he's seen you on Democracy Now! Numerous times, and he highly recommends to everybody as a news source. He asks, are there other sources of news, both in the US and internationally, that you would recommend that could help us gain a more well-rounded perspectives on issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I would add, I think that Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a great daily news source. You can get it on audio, you can get it on video. I also really rely on The Guardian for their climate coverage. I think as a daily news organization, they're unparalleled in their commitment to climate coverage. And I am a senior correspondent at The Intercept, which has done a lot of really good investigative work in these areas. So I just name those sort of top three. There's also a new media outlet that is more of a kind of a space for strategy and activism called theforge.org. And it has a lot of writing from frontline organizers. It's really quite exceptional.
The next question asks, do you think that disaster capitalism will come into play as countries begin to recover from the coronavirus pandemic? And if so, what can be done to minimize its influence?
Well, I would just say no, because they won't wait till we recover. They're doing it now. And, we're seeing, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, I started using the term disaster capitalism and the Shock Doctrine when I was writing about Hurricane Katrina, actually, and the way, a sort of twofold process of privatizing the response to the disaster so that it became a kind of profit free-for-all. So, quote unquote, rebuilding New Orleans and doing rescue and recovery badly was in large part a for-profit enterprise for politically connected contractors. And so this is previously work that had been done by government agencies, by nonprofits, and it was suddenly being done by companies like Fluor and Bechtel and Halliburton and Blackwater, who were doing a very poor job of doing what they were supposed to be doing, like putting tarps on people's houses where the roofs had blown off, but they were making an absolute killing off of it. So by disaster capitalism, I mean the sort of profiteering from disaster. But I think even more worrying is this, what I call the shock doctrine, which is the strategy of using these moments of shock and disorientation, and the fact that when we are in a true crisis, we necessarily are just focused on getting through that crisis, and we have a less energy to scrutinize our lawmakers. And so it becomes a fast forward moment to push through a corporate wish list. And we are seeing that already. We are seeing that in the form of bailouts for debt-laden fossil fuel companies who are using the pandemic to rescue a failing business model. We are seeing it in the form of the EPA not enforcing regulations under cover of pandemic. And we are also seeing a kind of a high-tech version of the shock doctrine or disaster capitalism, where we have companies like Google and Amazon using our experience in isolation and the fact that we've been doing, as I said earlier, telehealth, telelearning, to try to institutionalize that because it's profitable. It's profitable for them, and this is something that these companies have been pushing for a long time. We're also seeing this crisis being used to push driverless cars, which there were a lot of concerns about. All kinds of things are being repackaged as quote unquote no-touch technologies or reducing touch points. So concerns about our health are being harnessed to push this agenda. And I have a piece coming out tomorrow in The Intercept about this because these are real concerns, and crowded classrooms are a real concern if we don't get this virus under control. But we should also be talking about things like cutting classroom size in half, hiring more teachers, having outdoor education. If we aren't comfortable going to doctors' offices and hospitals, we can have trained nurses that are able to visit us. And this is what some countries are doing, as opposed to just trying to do, medicine over FaceTime with doctors, which frankly misses a lot.
Another question is, would you think that the new normal will imply a decrease in greenhouse gas emissions as we've witnessed so far during the global lockdown?
I'm really concerned that it will not. These questions around do I think it will or it won't? I mean, I'm somebody who believes in social movements. I believe in activism. So I don't believe anything is foretold, right? I think that if you leave if you leave a system that is built to maximize profit and growth to its own devices and don't push back against it, then what we will end up with is a rebound, and which is what we saw after the 2008 financial crisis. We saw a dip in 2009 in greenhouse gas emissions, but it rebounded to even higher levels. And there's going to be a message that's going to kind of treat hyper-consumption as a patriotic duty, right? Many of you are too young to remember this, but after the September 11th attacks, we heard from politicians, in Washington and in New York, that the best way to express solidarity for the victims was to go shopping, go to Disney World, get on an airplane, and fuel the American economy. We're going to be hearing a whole lot of that. And so I think, like I said, I don't think any of this is written, none of it is foretold. We can build on the fact that we are realizing that a lot of travel that we do is unnecessary. There is a lot more that we can do by teleconference. We should save our travel for what is truly essential. We should save our fossil fuel consumption for what is truly essential as we roll out low carbon transportation infrastructure. And so it will rebound unless we have a plan for it not to, is the short answer, because that's what our system is built to do. And we are already seeing, as I said, examples of governments trying to revive their economies and get them back to growth by slashing environmental regulations. So China is doing this. China is saying, we're going to get our economy back to growth. And for the time being, we're not going to enforce environmental laws. In Australia, the government is calling for what they call a gas-led recovery, which is exactly what it sounds like. And they're calling for cutting, quote unquote, green tape in order to have that gas-led recovery. There's no doubt that the usual tricks will be in display.
Another question from the chat asks, I love the points you make about the intersectionality of the climate crisis. Are there specific examples you've seen other than the Green New Deal and the Nurses Coalition you mentioned, maybe at Rutgers or in larger communities, where coalition building around the climate crisis has occurred?
So that's a great question. I mean, I think that there are a lot of initiatives around the Green New Deal where people are sort of adding to the parts that are missing. There's the Red Deal, if people are interested, which is a group of Indigenous scholars and grassroots organizers who've come together to add to the New Deal vision a more Indigenous informed and centered vision. At Rutgers, we've been hosting a series of events that are trying to fill in some of the blind spots of the Green New Deal. One of them is about Indigenous knowledge in the Green New Deal. One of them is about the care economy in the Green New Deal that brought together teachers, nurses, home care workers, disability rights activists, looking at care labor as low carbon work. And so recognizing that women's labor is often not recognized as part of this discussion. And so that was a really, really fruitful discussion of sort of visioning what education would look like if it were transformed based on what scientists are telling us we need to do. And interestingly, one of the things came up was smaller classes, more teachers, electric school buses, permaculture gardens, serving food in the cafeteria, all kinds of great ideas, right? But women are often not invited to be into these climate spaces, women workers. So that's a piece of it. We also had a really fruitful discussion with migrant rights organizers about migration and a Green New Deal. And it was it was looking at the rights of migrants who have been displaced by many factors, including climate disruption as a driver of migration. But we were also working with an amazing organizer and theorist named Saket Soni, who has started something called Resilience Force, which is really exciting, one of the more exciting initiatives I've come across. And Resilience Force is referring to the immigrant workforce that makes American societies more resilient in the face of climate shocks. This is happening already. We've talked about it a little in the context of the pandemic, but the truth is that the people who pick up the debris, fix the houses, and rebuild after disasters are overwhelmingly immigrant workers and are often deported after their work is done. And so the work Saket is doing is about really recognizing and valorizing this labor as something that needs to be compensated and have security and protections because it is so central. So those are some examples. And another kind of Rutgers example that I could share is that one of the things that's interesting about the student organizing at Rutgers is that, as at every campus, there is a vibrant fossil fuel divestment movement. There's also a movement of students calling for divestment from the prison industrial complex. And there's also a movement of students calling for divestment from Israeli apartheid. And Rutgers is one of the few schools where all of these campaigns have merged, and the students are working together to draw connections between the various divestment movements and present a coherent front to the administration. And I wish I could report to you that they have won.
Another question is, while we continue to push for adequate climate mitigation efforts, how do you think we can balance our efforts with the already very pressing need for climate adaptation?
I'm just looking for that in the chat. So the question is about balancing mitigation and adaptation. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, yeah. You know, I think as much as possible, we need to be doing both at the same time. I mentioned the Civilian Conservation Corps. It's a good example, right? I mean, because trees sequester carbon and they make us more resilient and sturdier in the face of shocks. We are going to have to do both. We are going to have to do both. And as much as possible, we need mitigation that builds the adaptation in. I'm going to start getting shorter answers because I realize we're running out of time.
Another question is, what are some of the most effective strategies for holding corporations accountable for the climate crisis in instances where climate litigation is not necessarily feasible? How might transnational advocacy networks play a role in enhancing corporate accountability?
So there's some really great campaigning going on now that is transnational. You can go to followthemoneypipeline.org. And this is a campaign that is going after the financing of fossil fuel projects as a point of leverage. You know, I think that those lawsuits that were mentioned continue to be important, but the truth is that we need to be working on multiple fronts, right? The direct divestment from fossil fuels, the legislative transitions from fossil fuels, like regional Green New Deals, as we wait for there to be some momentum in Washington. And we also need to follow the money to who is financing these fossil fuel projects. And that brings us to the banks, the hedge funds, and the insurance companies. And so this is a really great tactic because, you know, one of the problems with fossil fuel based campaigns is that they aren't really vulnerable to consumer pressure in the same way that other products that sell directly to the public are, because, you know, a lot of what we are campaigning for as climate activists is for people to have better solutions, right? They don't, you know, in most parts of the country, people don't have the option to be able to get their energy from renewables. So they get it from coal, or they, you know, in a lot of parts of the country, there isn't the infrastructure either for good public transit or for electric vehicles. So because of that, I mean, nobody takes any joy in going to the gas station. You go because you have to, right? And there's very little brand loyalty when it comes to whether or not you get your oil from, you know, Shell or Exxon. You just go to wherever's closer. There's more consumer leverage when it comes to something like Chase Bank. And, you know, Chase's has put a staggering amount of money since the negotiation of the Paris Agreement. I think $180 billion in new fossil fuel financing, and you know, people do have a consumer relationship with Chase. They can pull their money from Chase. They can cut up their Chase credit card and use a different credit card. So I think that that's, you know, one other point of leverage. I don't think any one of these tactics are like the tactic that's going to get us there, but I think there's a little bit of a kind of a swarm approach where you get them from every direction. And this is a moment of vulnerability. Like, let's be very clear. It is a stupid time to invest in fossil fuels. In addition to it being immoral, makes bad economic sense.
I think that's a very nice segue to another question that asks, can you point us towards the groups who can share the most revealing data about historical subsidies to pharmaceutical, oil, gas, industrial, agriculture, and other extractive industries, and diversion of public resources through privatization of services?
Public Citizen is a really good resource for this. So I would encourage that. If you're looking for public subsidies of fossil fuel specifically, Oil Change International is your go-to as a resource.
One question in the chat asked, do you think there's any hope or point in trying to convince the other side of the climate movement, Should the work of communicating about the climate crisis focus on coalescing and mobilizing power amongst those who already understand the need to act now?
You know, I tend to think so, because I think that there is a tendency to go after the hardest to convince people first. You know, the people who are kind of most entrenched in a denial mindset and have really a kind of developed a whole identity around it, because it comes as a sort of package with other right-wing worldviews. So people will tend to feel like attacked if you try to convince them that climate change is real. What I have found as somebody, you know, like I was mentioning at the beginning, when I was out there, you know, this fall talking about On Fire to people who absolutely believe that climate change is real, are concerned about it enough to want to, you know, hear what I have to say, right? There was still a big sense of, it's too late, there's nothing we can do, it's not realistic. I think that is a much, much larger group, and also a more possible to motivate and organize group than going straight to the kind of hard denier. So yeah, that's where I'd focus my energy.
So another question asks, what are some of the most effective strategies for holding corporations accountable for the climate crisis in instances where climate litigation is not necessarily feasible? How might transnational, sorry, go ahead.
We already answered that.
Okay. And how might transnational advocacy networks play a role in enhancing corporate accountability?
We already answered that exact question. Or I tried.
Oh, sorry.
I did.
Sorry, I did not.
That's okay.
I'm not doing a good job.
You are. You're doing a great job. Blame Zoom. I blame Zoom for everything.
Okay, so the next question is, I keep thinking about the role of that universal design principles. Okay, should play in addressing all kinds of crisis injustices, striving toward designing environments, products, and communications that are equitable, flexible, etc., so that exceptions aren't constantly required to meet the diversity of needs and abilities that exist. Not sure exactly where I'm trying to go with this, but since exceptions generally introduce much higher cost in any process, is there an economic argument that might appeal to the repentant capitalists who seem to be calling the shots those days?
Quite possibly, especially now, right? I think there are arguments that can work now that wouldn't have worked a couple of months ago. Because we do need to be designing an economic stimulus. And there is going to be some kind of big infrastructure rollout. And the question is it going to be an infrastructure that locks us into a future that we don't want to go to, whether it's because it is doubling down on fossil fuels or because it's some kind of high-tech surveillance state, or are we going to get what we actually need to take care of each other and the planet? So yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point and a really good idea. I mean, I think that the other thing that we need to be embedding, and I think that this is related to the adaptation versus mitigation question, is, you know, we have to be honest that the future that we're building for is a future with a lot of shocks. You know, we're living through one right now, and it is, as you know, many climate activists have said, this is a taste of a future that we are building, which is going to have a lot of crises. Some of them will be more local than this one, you know, just affecting one ecosystem. Some of them will be global, but we need to be building infrastructure that has give, that has some kind of padding in it. I think a lot of what we have seen and what has made this pandemic so lethal in the United States is the fact that there was just no give in the system. I mean, you look at hospitals that were already filled to capacity because they were run on this sort of hyper efficiency model that saw any empty bed as a failure and as a net loss, right? But that didn't leave any kind of cushion for a shock to come along, where you actually need there to be given the system for medical supplies, for beds, for care workers, right? And so however we think about the future, it has to have some give in it, because there are going to be shocks. And what is going to determine whether we are just blown backwards, as we have been in this case, or whether we have some resilience in the face of it, is whether or not we build systems that has some cushion in them.
If you have time for one last question, another question from the chat says, your book, This Changes Everything, opened my eyes to how climate deniers think, how they privately accept climate change, but would never do so publicly. The other side has started to change their rhetoric, like BP/Duke Energy with their 2050 net zero emissions goals. What do you think has changed?
I don't know if it really is a big change. You know, we've been seeing this kind of rhetoric on and off over more than a decade. You know, BP rebranded itself Beyond Petroleum, and this is, you know, a decade ago, and said, you know, we're not an oil and gas company anymore. We're an energy company. We're building, you know, wind turbines and solar farms, and then the price of oil went up, and it became profitable to be in the oil business, and then they just weren't interested in renewable energy anymore. So I don't know that there is a huge shift. I mean, like in This Changes Everything, I look at different sort of kind of greenwashing moments. You know, Richard Branson announcing that his airline was going to give all of its profits to solving climate change. You know, that was a decade ago, and, you know, very little has come out of that. So now it's Jeff Bezos, and he's making grand promises. But I don't frankly see a lot new there, I'm sorry to say. And I think that was the last question. That doesn't feel like a great note to end on. So I'm just going to say that it was a pleasure to sort of be with you all. I think we've got a ways to go to figure out how to create these spaces where we really feel a sense of togetherness. But I think it is really worth investing in that. I'm really, really grateful to you for not letting our current crisis change the subject. The challenge is to add, right? To find more points of intersection, of interconnection between all of these crises that we face together, but not to treat them as if they are in competition, or that we can afford to take our eyes off of the question of whether or not we are going to have a habitable future for ourselves and for coming generations. So I really am grateful to you for that. This is the first climate conference I've been to since the pandemic started. Many of them were canceled and not rescheduled, so good for you. And I really appreciate it and look forward to collaborating a lot more in the future. And if there are any graduating students on the call, I'd like to say congratulations.
Well, thank you so much for that. We're so excited that you were able to come join us. And then thank you for staying on a little bit longer than we had asked you for. We'd like to give you a round of applause. It was a great discussion. Thank you so much. There's a lot of thank you messages coming in the chat as well.
It was my pleasure.
So
take care, everybody. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye. So thank you, everybody. I know that everybody's getting out already. So Georgia, did you want to take over?
Yeah, sure. So just a reminder that the conference continues into tomorrow at 1 p.m. So if you would all like to come back tomorrow as well for more presentations. Yes.
Did you want to still do the round? Sorry, I don't even know how to call it.
Yes. Yes, I almost forgot. So we are going to be offering breakout rooms. So
yeah, breakout rooms, exactly.
To stay for a discussion. We're going to, whoever in like a minute or two is still here, break out into the random breakout rooms. So yes.
Okay, so
yeah.
And then tomorrow we will start at 1 p.m. So if you could come back, if you're not staying for the breakout rooms, that would be great. And thank you for joining for the whole day, I guess. And if you're going to stay on, that would be great too. So Georgia, should I, it seems like not many people.
Yes, it does seem.
Should I still create? Do people want to?
So, let's see. 9 participants.
Maybe you can just use this space. There are not that many people left if you like.
We should maybe stop the recording.
Yes, that's a very good point. So let me stop recording.